The rope cut so deep into the man's wrists that the bark of the oak had turned dark with his blood. Four of them. Four grown men, leather vests still on, patches torn but visible, hanging from the same massive trunk like old coats forgotten on a hook. Their boots dangled 6 inches off the dirt. Their heads hung low. The youngest one was still breathing. Barely. A small boy in a red windbreaker stood at the edge of the clearing with a juice box in his hand, his eyes wide, his sneakers planted in the pine needles. He had wandered off the trail to chase a rabbit. He was 7 years old. Now he was looking at four bikers tied up and left to die. And the strange thing, the thing nobody could explain later, was that he didn't run. He set the juice box down on a flat rock. He took one step forward. And then another. Who tied them up? Why? And what would a kid do with that? Stay with me on this one. The boy's name was Caleb. He had walked half a mile from the picnic table where his mother was setting out paper plates and arguing on the phone with his aunt. The forest behind the rest stop on Route 14 in northern Pennsylvania was thick that May. Pine and oak. Old growth that hadn't been touched in 50 years. There was a service road that the locals called Crow Cut, and beyond it a clearing where teenagers used to drink and where hunters parked their trucks in October. That's where the four men were. Four Hell's Angels. Real ones. The kind of patches you don't fake unless you want a problem. Caleb didn't know any of that. He didn't know what a 1%er diamond meant. He didn't know what the death's head on the back of a vest stood for. He saw four men hurt, and he saw the rope, and he saw the youngest one's chest moving up and down in tiny shallow jerks. The other three were still. Their faces were swollen. One had a split eyebrow that had crusted over in the heat. Another had lost a tooth, and the blood had run down his beard and dried into a stiff brown crust. The fourth was the biggest. Maybe 60 years old. Gray ponytail. A scar that ran from his jaw to the collar of his shirt. He looked like he had been in the worst of it. His head was down all the way to his chest. Caleb couldn't tell if he was breathing or not. The boy was small for his age. He had asthma. He carried an inhaler in his back pocket because his mother insisted, and he hated the way it tasted, but he carried it anyway. He walked right up to the youngest man. Got close enough to touch the worn leather of his boot. The man's eyes were closed. His lips were cracked. There was a sticker on the side of his vest that said Patriot Brothers, and another one that said Property of, and a name Caleb couldn't read because the dust had stuck to it. Caleb said hello. He said it twice. He said, "Are you sleeping?" The man's eyes opened a sliver. Pale blue. Bloodshot. The man's mouth tried to make a word and couldn't. His tongue was thick. He was severely dehydrated. He had been hanging there for almost 20 hours. Caleb didn't understand any of it, but he understood thirsty. He went back and got the juice box from the rock. He held the straw up to the man's mouth. The man drank. He drank slowly. He drank like a man who had forgotten how. Then he turned his head toward the others and made a noise that wasn't a word. It was a groan that meant them. Help them. Caleb looked at the other three. He looked at the empty juice box. He looked at the path he had come from. And he turned around and started running back toward his mother. He ran the way a child runs when something inside them has just grown up by 10 years in 3 minutes. Behind him, the youngest biker, whose name was Danny, watched the small red windbreaker disappear into the trees and tried to lift his head and couldn't and let it fall back against his chest and started, for the first time since his ribs were broken the night before, to cry. Caleb's mother was named Rachel. She was 34. She worked at a hospital in Scranton as a billing clerk, and she had not slept well in 3 years because her husband, Caleb's father, had died in a roadside accident on Route 6 outside Tunkhannock in the spring of his 33rd year, and grief was something she carried in her shoulders and her jaw and the tight way she held a steering wheel. They were driving to her sister's house in Bradford. They had stopped at the rest area because Caleb needed to pee and because Rachel needed a minute to breathe. She was on the phone with her sister who wanted to talk about money, and she was rubbing her temple, and she did not see her son walk away. When Caleb came running out of the trees with pine needles stuck to his red windbreaker and his face white as paper, she dropped the phone. She dropped it on the picnic table, and it clattered onto the concrete, and the screen cracked, and she didn't notice. He was talking too fast. Men, tide, tree, hurt, drinking, juice. She had to kneel down and hold his shoulders and make him say it again. She thought at first he had imagined it, or seen something on a screen, and confused it with real life. Then she saw his hands. There was blood on his fingers. Just a little. A smear. From where he had touched the rope at Danny's wrist when he had pressed the juice box up to the man's mouth. Rachel's whole chest went cold. She looked at the woods. She told Caleb to stay. She told him don't move. She walked over to a trucker who was eating a sandwich at the next picnic table, and she said in a voice that didn't sound like her own that she needed help. The trucker was a man named Earl Whitcomb out of Erie. 61. A grandfather. He was hauling steel coils to Pittsburgh. He set down the sandwich. He looked at the boy. He looked at the woman. Then he stood up and said, "Show me." Earl had been a medic in the Army a long time ago. He had a flashlight in his rig. He had a knife. He told Rachel to call 911. She did. The dispatcher took her name and the address of the rest stop and asked her to repeat what her son had said. Then the dispatcher went very quiet for a moment and said to her in a careful voice that troopers would be there in 12 minutes and to please not approach the scene. Earl had already gone into the trees. Caleb led him by the hand. Earl walked the way a man walks when he has seen things and doesn't want to see them again, but knows he is going to. They came around the bend in the service road. Earl saw the oak. He saw the 4 men. He stopped for 1 full second. He said a word under his breath that he never said in front of children, and Caleb pretended not to hear it. Earl let go of the boy's hand and ran the last 20 yards. The youngest one, Danny, was 24. The next was named Ruiz, 40. The third was Slim, 52. The biggest was the one with the gray ponytail, and that name was Bull, 63. Earl knew none of these names yet. He just knew that 2 of the 4 had pulses he could find, and 2 he couldn't, and that meant work, and work was the thing that kept the panic from taking the steering wheel out of your hands. He cut Danny down first because Danny was breathing. He laid him in the dirt. He cleared his airway. He used the water bottle from his hip pocket to wet the man's lips. He cut Slim down second because Slim was making a noise. Slim collapsed in a heap. Earl rolled him onto his side. Ruiz was next. Ruiz had a pulse, but it was thready. Earl laid him flat. He felt the side of his neck. He counted. Bull was the worst. Bull was the heaviest. The rope had cut so deep into his wrists that the skin had peeled. His shoulders had dislocated under his own weight. He was 63 years old, and he had hung from that tree for almost a full day. When Earl cut the last rope, the big man came down like a sack of grain, and Earl could not catch all of him, and Bull's gray head hit the dirt with a sound that Earl would remember for the rest of his life. He pressed 2 fingers under the man's jaw. He waited. He moved them. He waited. He pressed the heel of his hand to the center of the chest and started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing with his juice box. He had brought it back. He didn't know why. He held it in both hands. He watched the trucker push down on the big man's chest. He watched the big man's mouth open as the air came out. He counted in his head along with Earl, because counting was something you could do when you didn't know what else to do. By the time the troopers came up the service road in 2 cars with their lights on but their sirens off, Earl had gotten Bull's heart to start again. Twice. It had stopped twice. It started twice. The first trooper was a woman named Sergeant Kimberly Vasquez. 8 years on the force. She had served 2 tours in Iraq before that. She had seen a lot. She had not seen 4 Hells Angels strung up from a single oak tree in her own patrol district. She got out of her car, and she said quietly to her partner, Jesus Christ. Then she walked over and she did her job. The medics came. 2 ambulances. Then a third. Then a fourth. They worked on the bikers in the dirt, because moving them too fast was going to kill the ones who were still alive. Bull went into the first bus. Danny in the second. Ruiz in the third. Slim was pronounced at the scene. He had been dead about an hour. Caleb watched all of it. Rachel had come down the trail at some point, and she pulled him against her hip, and she covered his eyes with her hand, but he had already seen everything there was to see. The sky was getting low and orange between the pines. A trooper handed Caleb a foil blanket and a bottle of water and patted him on the head and said, "You did good, kid." Caleb didn't say anything. He held the bottle in both hands the way he had held the juice box. The forest got quiet again. The kind of quiet a forest has after sirens. By that night, Bull was in surgery at Jasinger Medical Center 2 hours south. Danny and Ruiz were stable. Slim was in a refrigerated drawer. The state police had the clearing taped off, and a forensics team was working under floodlights. Sergeant Vasquez was at the rest stop with a notepad and a quiet voice talking to Rachel and to Caleb. Caleb sat on the picnic table with his foil blanket. He had answered every question she asked him. He told her about the rabbit. He told her about the juice box. He told her the youngest man had blue eyes and looked like he was sleeping. Vasquez wrote it all down, and she did not interrupt and she did not push. When she was done, she crouched in front of him so they were eye to eye, and she said, "You saved 3 lives today, son." Caleb thought about that. He thought about Slim, the one who didn't make it. He said, "But not the other man." Vasquez didn't lie to him. She said, "No, not him. But the other 3 are alive because you didn't keep walking." Rachel cried then. Quiet. Hand over her mouth. Caleb just nodded once. They drove home that night. Not to the sisters. Home. Rachel called Bradford and said something had happened and they would come another time. The next morning the story was on the local news. Then the regional news. Then by Monday afternoon it was on the national wire. 4 Hells Angels found tied to a tree in northern Pennsylvania. 3 rescued. 1 dead. A child had found them. The child's name and face were withheld. The questions came fast. Who had done it? Why? The Hells Angels were not a group, anyone tied to trees casually. There were a lot of people in a lot of clubhouses who were now very awake. The state police stopped giving press conferences. The FBI took the case because the Patches Bull and the others wore had been worn at events in 3 different states, and one of the men had been a federal informant in a different investigation entirely. That last part didn't come out for 2 weeks. When it did, everything changed. Bull woke up on a Wednesday, 6 days after the rescue. He was breathing on a tube and he could not move his right arm because the nerve damage in his shoulder was permanent now, and he was 63 years old, and he had a wife in West Virginia who was sitting in the chair beside his bed when he opened his eyes. The wife's name was Carolyn. She had been with him 40 years. She held his good hand. She told him what had happened. She told him Slim was gone. She told him Danny and Ruiz were down the hall. She told him about the boy, about the juice box, about a trucker named Earl. Bull lay there a long time without saying anything. Then he asked her to come closer. He whispered something into her ear. She nodded. She wrote it down on the back of a hospital napkin. Then she got up and went out into the hallway and made a phone call. The phone call was to a man named Dutch in Allentown. Dutch was the chapter president. Within 48 hours, the word went out across the entire East Coast and the Midwest and California and Texas. Find the boy. Find the trucker. Don't touch the boy or the trucker. But find them. Be ready. Then Dutch made a second call. To a different kind of person. The kind of person who finds out things. The kind of person who wears no patches and rides no motorcycle and lives in a quiet house and answers a phone that has no contacts in it. Dutch said one sentence into that phone. We need to know who tied my brothers to that tree. The man on the other end said okay. And he hung up. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. The man's name was Carl Ostrander. He was 59. He had been a CID investigator in the Army before he retired. He had done 2 private contracts overseas. He had a daughter who had married a Hells Angel 10 years ago, and that was how the world worked. And that was how a quiet retired investigator with a clean record ended up taking a call from Dutch. Carl drove to Pennsylvania the next morning. He started at the rest stop on Route 14. He walked the trail. He walked the service road. He stood under the oak. He looked at the rope marks on the bark. He looked at the dirt. He noticed 3 things the state police had also noticed, and one thing they had not. The thing they had not noticed was a small piece of black duct tape stuck to the back of a stump 15 feet from the tree. The duct tape had a single black fiber on it. The fiber was not from any of the 4 bikers. Carl took it. He drove to a friend in Pittsburgh who ran an independent lab. The friend ran the fiber. It was carbon fiber from a particular brand of body armor, sold mostly to a particular kind of contractor. Carl drove back to Pennsylvania. By that point, the FBI had identified the connection between Slim and the federal informant case. They had also identified that Bull's chapter had been quietly running interference against a meth network out of Ohio for almost 2 years. The meth network had a name that nobody said out loud. It was run by men who used to be cops. 3 of them. Detroit, Cleveland, Toledo. Pulled off the force 10 years ago for a drug evidence scandal and rebuilt as something worse. They were the ones who tied the 4 men to the tree. They had wanted Bull. Bull had information. Bull had names. They had grabbed all 4 off a back road outside Bradford and taken them into the woods and beat them and hung them up and waited for Bull to talk. Bull hadn't talked. Bull was a hard old man. They had left them all there to die slow. They had not counted on a 7-year-old. They had been watching the rest stop from a service road on the other ridge, with binoculars when Caleb came back out of the trees with his mother. They had heard the sirens. They had run. They had a 4-hour head start. The FBI was now on them. Carl Ostrander was now on them. And every chapter of the Hells Angels from Pennsylvania to California was on them. The thing Bull had whispered into Carolyn's ear, the thing she had written on the napkin, was 3 names. Carl had those names. Carl was the one who would do something with them. The little boy did not know any of this. Caleb went back to school the next Monday. His mother had decided keeping him home would only make it bigger in his head. His teacher had been warned, and the principal had been warned, and the school had quietly told the local news to stay off the property. Caleb sat at his desk and did his math worksheet. The other kids didn't know what had happened. Rachel had not told anyone. The Hells Angels had not told anyone. Earl Whitcomb had given exactly one statement to the police, and then gone back to driving steel from Erie to Pittsburgh and refused all interviews. The story was already getting buried by other news. It would have stayed buried if it weren't for what happened next. On the Saturday 2 weeks after the rescue, a single black motorcycle pulled into the parking lot of the elementary school in Caleb's town. The school was empty. It was a Saturday. The motorcycle was followed by another. And another. By the time Rachel drove past at noon, on her way back from the grocery store with Caleb in the back seat, there were almost 40 bikes parked in even rows in the lot. Men in leather vests stood beside them. Not loud. Not yelling. Just standing. Waiting. Rachel slowed the car. Caleb sat up. He saw them. He did not say anything. He looked at his mother. His mother gripped the steering wheel. She kept driving. She drove home. She locked the door. She called Sergeant Vasquez. Vasquez said she would come over. While they were waiting, Caleb went to the front window and looked out at the street. Rachel pulled him back. She told him no. He said, "But they came for me." Rachel didn't know what to say. She had read about the Hells Angels. She had read what they were and what they had done. She also remembered what her son had done. She did not know how to put those two things in the same sentence. Vasquez arrived. She had already been on the phone with the FBI. She told Rachel that the bikers were not there to hurt anyone. She said she had a relationship with one of the chapter officers. She said she had spoken with him. She said the bikers had a request. They wanted to come to the house. They wanted to thank the boy. Rachel said no. She said it 3 times. Vasquez did not push. She said she would tell them. She left. An hour later, Vasquez came back. She said the bikers had agreed to a different proposal. They would not come to the house. They would gather at the public park down the road on Sunday afternoon. Anyone who wanted to be there could be. Anyone who didn't could stay home. They wanted to do it in public. They wanted Caleb to know who he had saved. Rachel sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She looked at her son. She looked at her hands. Caleb said quietly, "Mom, I want to go." Rachel said no. He said, "Please." She said, "Let me think." She thought. She thought all night. By morning she had decided. And the decision was the one that nobody, not the bikers, not the cops, not Earl, not Carl Ostrander, had seen coming. She said yes. But not the way they wanted. Rachel called Vasquez at 6 in the morning on Sunday. She said her son would meet them. But not at the park down the road. At a different place. At the rest stop on Route 14. At the picnic table where it had started. And she said she wanted Earl Whitcomb there if he was willing. And she said she wanted only 10 of them. Not 40. Not 200. 10. The 10 who knew Bull and Danny and Ruiz best. And she said she wanted Bull there if he could travel. Bull could travel. Bull had been discharged the day before. He was in a wheelchair. His right arm was in a sling. His face was still the color of a thunderstorm. Carolyn drove him up. Earl drove down from Erie. Vasquez was there in plain clothes. 2 FBI agents were parked half a mile up the road in an unmarked car. Carl Ostrander was watching the woods. The 10 bikers came on their bikes. They parked them in a single neat row. They turned the engines off. They took off their helmets. They walked together to the picnic table where Rachel was sitting with Caleb. Caleb was holding a juice box. Rachel had given him one before they left the house. She didn't know why. It felt right. The bikers walked up. They stopped a respectful 10 feet from the table. Bull was wheeled to the front. Carolyn pushed his chair. Bull looked at the boy. The boy looked at Bull. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. The wind moved in the pine. A car went by on Route 14. Somewhere a hawk called. Bull lifted his good hand. He put it on his chest. He lowered his head. The other 9 men did the same. It was not a salute. It was something older than a salute. Bull spoke. His voice was wrecked from the tube. He said, "Son." He said, "I owe you my life." He said, "My brother behind me owes you his." He said, "The brothers who couldn't be here today owe you theirs." He said, "I am 63 years old, and I have been a lot of things and most of them not good." He said, "But I will tell you one thing about me that is true." He said, "When a man owes a debt like the one I owe you, that man pays it for the rest of his days." He said, "And I will." Caleb looked at his mother. His mother nodded. Caleb stood up. He walked the 10 feet to where Bull sat in the wheelchair. He held out the juice box. He said, "You can have this one." Bull took it with his good hand. The big man's eyes went wet. His shoulders started to shake. Carolyn put her hand on his good shoulder and squeezed. Bull lowered his head all the way down, and he wept the way old men weep when they have nothing left to protect. And the 9 other bikers behind him took off their colors. Every one of them. They folded the leather vests with the death's heads and the property of Patches and the diamond pins, and they laid them on the picnic table in front of the boy, and they did not put them back on. Not that day. Vasquez was crying too. She tried to hide it. She didn't. Earl Whitcomb stood off to the side with his hands in his pockets and watched, and his face did not move at all, but the muscle in his jaw was working. The whole thing took about 20 minutes. Then the bikers picked up their vests and put them back on. They got on their bikes. They rode away one at a time. Bull was the last. Carolyn wheeled him to the van. He held the juice box on his lap. He looked back at Caleb once before he was lifted in. He raised his good hand. Caleb raised his hand back. The van drove away. By the end of that week, the meth network had collapsed. The 3 former cops who had tied the 4 bikers to the Oak were arrested in 3 different states on a Thursday morning. One in a hotel in St. Louis, one at a relative's house in Tampa, one at a regional airport in Kentucky as he tried to board a flight to Mexico. The arrests were federal. They had been built from the names Bull whispered to Carolyn, and from the carbon fiber Carl Ostrander found on the stump, and from a network of phone records the FBI had been quietly building for 2 years. The story of the arrests made the news. The story of what had happened in the clearing made the news. The story of the boy and the juice box did not, because Rachel asked that it not, and because, for the first time in a long time, a lot of very different people agreed on something. Caleb went back to school. He grew up. He became a paramedic. He did not become a Hell's Angel, and he did not become a cop, and he did not become anything other than a quiet, steady man who carried a juice box in his bag at every shift, even though he never explained to his coworkers why. Rachel remarried when Caleb was 13. To a kind man who did not try to be his father. Earl Whitcomb retired 3 years after the rescue. He kept the foil blanket the trooper had given him that day. He kept it folded in a drawer. Bull lived another 9 years. He never rode again. His shoulder was finished. But every May, on the anniversary of the rescue, he sent a small package to Rachel's house. Inside the package was a single juice box and a card. The card always said the same 5 words. I'm still paying it. The year Bull died, the package still came. Carolyn had set them up to be sent. Caleb was 24 that year. The same age Danny had been the day he hung from the tree. Danny himself, who had lived another 40 years and become a grandfather and a sober one, came to the funeral. He found Caleb in the back of the chapel. He shook his hand. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Caleb thought about Slim sometimes. The one who hadn't made it. He carried that. People who do hard things in the world often do. Rachel told him once, when he was 16 and the weight had come down on him for a week, that the math of saving people is not the math of saving all of them. She said, you saved 3. You were 7. Put it down. He put it down. Mostly. Some nights when an ambulance call ran long and a patient didn't make it and he sat in the bay with his hands shaking, he thought about a man with a gray ponytail in a hospital room and the words, I am still paying it. And he kept going. That is what the boy did. A child wandered off a trail to chase a rabbit. A child who was small for his age and carried an inhaler. A child who thought a juice box was something a man might want. He stepped into a thing that grown men with rifles and badges and patches had built for each other, and he changed the shape of it just by being there. He didn't fight. He didn't run away. He gave a juice box to a stranger, and he ran for his mother. The rest of it, the cops, the carbon fiber, the arrests in 3 states, all of it grew out of 3 minutes in a clearing with a 7-year-old. 2,000 riders stood at attention in their own driveways and parking lots and clubhouses on the morning of the 3rd Sunday in May, every year for the rest of their lives, in honor of a boy whose name most of them never learned. They called him the Juice Box Kid. They said it the way men say the names of saints, with the head a little down, with the voice a little soft, because the world is mostly hard, and once in a great while a child walks into a clearing and walks back out, and the whole thing bends towards something better. Some debts are not paid in money. Some are paid in showing up. Every May, every year, for the rest of your life.